بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام ورحمة الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اهتدى بهداه أما بعد. طيب شباب, today we continue from where we left off, and last week we began speaking about the Hadith al-Sahih and Shurut al-Sihha, the conditions of an authentic Hadith. In order for the scholars to grade a Hadith as Sahih, authentic, it must meet certain conditions. We mentioned they were 5. Without looking at our books, let's try to refresh our memories. Who can give us some of the conditions, the 5 conditions, in order for a Hadith to be graded as Sahih? Ibrahim.
The chain must be strong.
What do you mean by strong?
Consistent.
Connected.
Yeah.
Excellent. That the chain must be connected. It can't have gaps of missing people in the narration. The chain must be connected. That was the first one. What else? From the conditions of a hadith to be sahih.
All the people in that connection need to be trustworthy.
Excellent. And what does trustworthy mean, Walid?
Upright, considered upright by the people around them.
Okay.
At that time.
Excellent. But in particular, it means that the person must be
Muslim,
good,
sane,
sane, excellent,
reach puberty,
very good, except for the Sahabi, we said. And
how many more?
huh?
How many more?
He can't be a fasiq. Yeah, he can't be corrupt, a person of corruption. Very good. So they have to be trustworthy. What else does the narrator need to be? He can't just be trustworthy, he also needs to be
Good memory,
excellent, strong memory. And Salim, we said, strong in memory could mean 2 things. It could be memory in
recitation,
good, so memory from heart, or what? He might not be good memory in heart, but he can, excellent, or good in writing. Very good. That's what, 3 conditions? 2 more. The hadith, irregularities. Excellent. No shudud. So what does no shudud mean? If a hadith is shadh, what does it mean? We mentioned that last week. It can't.
A trustworthy narrator opposes another trustworthy narrator.
Excellent. When the trustworthy narrator, his narration opposes those who are like him or more trustworthy than him or more accurate. Ahsant. So no shudud, and the last condition, it cannot have anyone? No illah, deficiencies. And we said the knowledge of deficiencies, it was only a selected few from the Salaf who could look into their ilal to find hidden deficiencies in the hadith. Naam. Excellent, Shabab. Well done. طيب. Today now we take the next level after the Sahih, which is the Hasan. Okay? Hasan is a type of hadith. Let's see what it means. He says the Hasan hadith is that which has a continuous connected chain. So it's like the Sahih in this. Its chain is also connected. Okay? Made up of a reporter or reporters who are trustworthy. Same thing as the Sahih. Connected chain, trustworthy narrators, but who have a lesser level in memory. That's all it is. Have a lesser level in memory from similar authorities, similar reporters, and it's found to be free from shudud, irregularities, or defects, illah. For subhanallah, the Hasan and Sahih is very close. But the Hasan is a lower grade than the Sahih because it has one or more narrator who has a weaker memory. That's what Hasan means. But the narrators, they're trustworthy. The hadith, the chain is connected, has no deficiency, has no illah, but in memory, it might have someone who has a little bit of a weaker memory. This is what defines the Hasan. What's the ruling of the Hasan hadith? He says its ruling, it is similar to the Sahih in proof. Just like the Sahih is a dalil in our religion, the Hasan Hadith is also dalil in our religion, even though it is of a lesser level in strength, which is why all the scholars of fiqh used it as proof and acted upon it. And the majority of the scholars of Hadith accept it, along with the scholars of Usul al-Hadith and Usul al-Fiqh also. And now we have a photo of a Hadith that's Hasan. This is an example now. He says, ما أخرجه الترمذي. What Imam al-Tirmidhi has narrated, قال, so Imam al-Tirmidhi rahimahullah said, حدثنا قتيبة, we heard from Qutayba. حدثنا جعفر ibn Sulaiman. So Qutayba heard from Ja'far ibn Sulaiman. الضبعي عن أبي عمران الجوني. So he heard from Abi Imran al-Jawni عن أبي بكر ibn Abi Musa al-Ash'ari. Abu Bakr is the son of the great Sahabi Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. So he's narrating from his father Abu Musa al-Ash'ari قال سمعت أبي, I heard my father بحضرة العدو, in the company of the enemy, يقول, saying, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن أبواب الجنة تحت ظلال السيوف. The doors of paradise are underneath the shade of the swords. The doors of paradise are beneath the shade of the swords. We all know the famous hadith, paradise is beneath the feet of the mother. That hadith is not authentic. This is the authentic hadith. Paradise is beneath the shade of the swords. Is beneath the shade of the swords. Okay. The Shaykh Al-Tahan rahimahullah, he says, فهذا الحديث, this hadith, قال عنه الترمذي. Imam al-Tirmidhi said about this hadith, هذا حديث حسن غريب. This hadith is Hasan Gharib. So Imam al-Tirmidhi, he was known to give the grading of the hadith. Imam al-Tirmidhi was known to grade the hadith. Here he said this hadith is Hasan, meaning it's Hasan, and Gharib. We discussed what Gharib means previously. What does a hadith that's Gharib mean? Who can remind us? Excellent, one chain. It's from the categories of ahad, remember? One chain. So Imam al-Tirmidhi is saying this hadith is Hasanun Gharib. Okay, why is this hadith Hasan? Why is it not Sahih? قلت, meaning the author of the book, قلت وكان هذا الحديث حسنا, this hadith is Hasan لأن رجال إسناده الأربعة ثقات, because all four men in this chain are ثقات, trustworthy, strong, إلا جعفر ibn Sulaiman al-Dubai, except for that man in the chain, Ja'far ibn Sulaiman al-Dubai. He says, فَإِنَّهُ حَسَنُ الْحَدِيثِ, his hadith is Hasan. Why? Because his memory is not that strong. It's not as strong as others. The Shaykh says, لِذَلِكَ نَزَلَ الْحَدِيث عن مرتبة الصحيح إلى مرتبة الحسن. For that reason, cause of this narrator, cause his memory is not that strong, the hadith now drops from the level of sahih to hasan. So basically the difference between a sahih and a hasan is only in the memory. All the other conditions are met. Just the memory is a little bit or slightly weaker with one or more of the narrators in the chain. طيب. On the next page, Shabab, Imam al-Tirmidhi rahimahullah's statement, Hasanun Sahih. If you read Imam al-Tirmidhi's Jami', if you read his book in Hadith, first of all, Imam al-Tirmidhi is a muhaddith. If you don't know, his book is one of the 6 books of the Sunnah. We have Bukhari, we have Muslim, we have Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah. Those are the 6 books of Sunnah for us. That's where we find most of the Sunnah in those 6 books. There's others, but they're the main ones. Imam al-Tirmidhi is one of them. And he grades the hadith in his book sometimes. Sometimes in his grading, he would say about a hadith, Hasanun Sahih. If you don't study Mustalah, you get confused. Is the hadith Hasan or is it Sahih? Is it the level of Sahih or is it Hasan? He's saying Hasanun Sahih about the same hadith. What does Imam al-Tirmidhi mean when he says Hasanun Sahih about the same hadith? The scholars have explained the meaning of Imam al-Tirmidhi rahimahullah's statement where a hadith is Hasanun Sahih. And the best of those explanations is what Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentioned. Where he said, number one, if the hadith has 2 chains or more, then it means it's Hasan in one chain and Sahih in another chain. That's one interpretation. If the hadith has more than one chain, then it's Sahih in some chains and it's Hasan in other chains. Yani that chain met all the conditions. This chain has someone with a weak memory or a weaker memory. Okay? That's what it means, the ulama said. The other interpretation, if the hadith only has one chain, then what does Hasanun Sahih mean by Imam al-Tirmidhi? What that means is, some scholars classed the hadith Hasan and others classed it as Sahih. Yani they had a difference regarding the hadith, where some of them classed it as Hasan and some of them classed it as Sahih. But it does not affect us accepting it, because the Hasan and Sahih, we accept them both. Okay? This is the best as what has been mentioned regarding Imam al-Tirmidhi's word, Hasanun Sahih, about the same hadith. Tayyib Shabab. So we have Sahih, then we have Hasan. Now we move on to the next category, which is As-Sahih li ghayrihi. As-Sahih li ghayrihi means the hadith which is Sahih, but it is not Sahih in itself. But it only became Sahih because something supporting it. Okay, and we're going to explain it, inshallah, on the board. First of all, what's the definition? The definition of a Sahih li ghayrihi hadith, it is the Hasan li dhatihi. If it is narrated from another chain similar to it or stronger. It is called Sahih li ghayrihi because the authenticity did not come from the first chain itself. Rather, it came due to the other chains strengthening it. And to show this in a mathematical equation, the Shaykh says, look there. Hasan plus Hasan equals Sahih li ghayrihi. That's how it is. 1 plus 1 equals 2. So when you have a Hasan hadith, and that Hasan hadith has another chain which is also Hasan, together they support each other and they move to the level of Sahih li ghayrihi. Sahih for other than themselves. And now we will draw, or we will write our categories. SubhanAllah, the sisters moved the pens. They were here before the Salah. I think they put them in the next room. No, they lost. Alhamdulillah. طيب. If we actually, Ibrahim, can you go to Nidal in the radio station, please? And just ask him for the texters. I think they're in that pencil case that they took. Regarding the accepted hadiths that we accept, as we're going to see, there are 4 levels. There's 4 categories of the hadith that we accept. The first one is what we covered last week. We call it Sahih lidhatihi. Sahih in itself. That's the hadith that meets the 5 conditions that we spoke about. It's Sahih in itself. The second category after Sahih lidhatihi is Sahih lighayrihi. Sahih lighayrihi is when you have 2 Hasan narrations and they support each other to go up to the level of Sahih. Jazakallahu khairan. طيب. So number 1, Sahih lidhatihi. Number 2, Sahih lighayrihi. Number 3, Hasan lidhatihi. Number 4, Hasan lighayrihi. These 4 are the accepted hadiths. Anything below this becomes from the next topic, the rejected narrations. These 4 are the accepted. This is the strongest. That's their order. Sahih lidhatihi is the strongest. That's the hadith that's sahih in itself. Lidhatihi meaning in itself. That's the one that has the 5 conditions that we spoke about. And that's the strongest type. The Sahih lighayrihi is Sahih, but not like him in itself. He's Sahih because of something supporting him. And the best way to explain that, he is this guy, but when there's 2 of him, when there's 2 or more of this, it moves up to that level. Hasan plus Hasan equals Sahih lighayrihi. So it's not Sahih in itself. In itself, it's just Hasan. But because we get another Hasan like him, they push themselves up to this level. Sahih for other than himself. The third category is the Hasan lidhatihi. He's Hasan in himself. Meaning he met the 5 conditions except in memory, as we mentioned. That's the Hasan lidhatihi. The Hasan lighayrihi is exactly the same. So if Sahih lighayrihi is Hasan plus Hasan, Hasan plus Hasan is Sahih lighayrihi. What do you think Hasan lighayrihi would be? Give me another mathematical equation.
2 weaker hadith.
Excellent. Da'if plus da'if equals Hasan lighayrihi. But there's a condition. The weakness cannot be corruption in a narrator. It can't be that he's a liar. The weakness can only be in memory. Or something missing, someone missing in the chain. In other words, if the reason for weakness is an accusation on the narrator, we do not apply this. His hadith is rejected. But when it has what they call da'fun yasir, light weakness, one chain and then another chain of the same hadith which is also weak, together they will push themselves not to sahih but to Hasan lighayrihi. That's the lowest form of accepted hadiths in our deen. These are the 4 stages. And that's why he's saying here, Hasan lidhati plus Hasan lidhatihi equals Sahih lighayrihi. Its position, what's the position of the Sahih lighayri? It is higher in strength than Hasan and it is below Sahih. There. Sahih lighayri, it's higher than Hasan because it has more than one chain. That's Hasan. And that's common sense. 2 Hasan chains are stronger than 1 Hasan chain. Yeah? Because that's 2 or more Hasan chains here. So he's above Hasan, but he's still below Sahih lidhati, because he's the strongest. He's got the 5 conditions, all complete. Understood, Shabab?
Just, so when there's 2 Hasan,
No.
the narration should be similar in word or distinct?
Yes. It will be the same hadith.
So it's the same,
Naam.
but just different chains.
Different chains. Where this chain,
Same wording.
yeah. So if you look at that chain by itself, it's Hasan because it has a narrator with a weak memory. But the same hadith has another chain which is also Hasan. So together that hadith becomes Sahih li ghayrihi. Naam. This is the levels of the accepted hadith. Al-Maqbool. These are the 4 levels of the ahadith we accept.
I don't know if it's too soon to ask this question, but what makes a chain in of itself? Like, is there a time period
What makes a chain
in of itself?
in of itself?
Yeah, say there's one chain and another chain. Like, how does one chain become? How do you separate the two? That makes sense.
The way we separate it is from the chains. In the hadith, you have the hadith of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Then you have the Sahaba who narrated it. If 2 Sahaba narrated the same hadith, we've got now 2 chains. So he's going to have people that heard it of him, and then he's going to have people that heard it of him. That's how we know that this hadith has 2 chains now. You understand? If 3 Sahaba narrated it, he'll have narrators. 3 chains. So this science means looking in the chains, looking in the individuals in the chains to grade the hadith. To grade the hadith.
You said there are 4 types of accepted hadith. Is this across?
Yes, there's no khilaf. These are the principles set by all Ahl Sunnah, the scholars of hadith. The scholars of hadith all determine these to be the accepted ahadith in the religion.
The reason I ask is because other sects probably, I don't know which sects, but they use weak hadith as part of virtues.
Naam.
Is that something that falls under this?
Correct. Okay. Very good. That is a different topic. That mas'ala is not regarding these. It's regarding what comes after this, which is the weak that we're going to be covering. Weak hadith. Do we accept them or do we not? There's a difference of an opinion. Some scholars, they say as long as they are not in aqidah, okay, or halal and haram, we accept weak hadith. In other words, history, virtues, heart softness, and whatever else, it's okay. The second opinion, which is more the scholars of hadith, they say no. The maqbool is enough for us. Anything besides this, we don't accept in anything. And that's the khilaf. Some say this and some say that. So if someone follows the opinion of the ulama who say we take the weak hadith, he follows that opinion. I personally do not. I'm on the opinion that the weak narrations, we leave them because the authentic is enough for us, inshallah. That's me personally. طيب. Now look what he says. Now he's going to give you an example of a hadith Hasan, Sahih li ghayri. He says, Hadith Muhammad ibn Amr عن أبي سلمة عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالسواك عند كل صلاة. قال ابن الصلاح محمد بن عمرو بن علقمة من المشهورين بالصدق والصيانة لكنه لم يكن من أهل الإتقان حتى ضعفه بعضهم من جهة سوء حفظه ووثقه بعضهم لصدقه وجلالته فحديثه من هذه الجهة حسن فلما انضم إلى ذلك كونه روي من أوجه أخر زال بذلك ما كنا نخشاه عليه من جهة سوء حفظه وانجبر به ذلك النقص اليسير فصح هذا الإسناد والتحق بدرجة الصحيح. Here he's giving you an example. We've got the chain. Muhammad ibn Amr heard from Abi Salama, who heard from Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, that An-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, if it was not out of fear for my ummah, I would have ordered them to use the siwak at every prayer. That's the hadith. Ibn Salah said, Ibn Salah was one of the big muhaddithin of the past. He's written books on Mustalah. Ibn Salah said, Muhammad ibn Amr ibn Alqama, this man at the beginning of the chain, Muhammad ibn Amr ibn Alqama, min al-mashhurina bis-sidq, he was known to be truthful when he speaks, okay? Was-siyana, and his work in hadith, yani. He was well known. لكنه لم يكن من أهل الإتقان, but he was not from those who were very accurate. So in other words, he's talking about what now? Memory. Okay? حتى ضعفه بعضهم من جهة سوء حفظه. Some of the scholars labeled him as a weak narrator because of his memory. And others labeled him as good because of his trustworthiness and his honesty. He was a person of deen that was praised. Okay? He says, so his hadith here, this particular hadith is Hasan. But when this particular hadith came with other narrations, which it has, the fear of his bad memory is removed now, because we've got supporting narrations of it. So his hadith has now moved from Hasan to Sahih li ghayrihi. If he was on his own, it would be in the category of Hasan. But because we had supporting narrations that are also Hasan, his hadith now has gone up to Sahih li ghayrihi. طيب. You got the camera on and I'm walking around. طيب شباب. So that's the Sahih li ghayri. The next mas'ala is this guy here. We already touched up on him. The last category of maqbool, of accepted hadith. And we said that is the da'if plus the da'if. When we have a number of da'if narrations, they push themselves up to be Hasan li ghayrihi, Hasan for other than themselves. And that's why he says here in the definition, it is the da'if, the weak, if it has a number of chains. The Hasan li ghayri is the da'if hadith that has a number of chains. And the reason for its weakness, look, is not due to the narrator being corrupt or a liar. So it's not weak because the narrator is corrupt or a liar. If he's corrupt or a liar, we X his hadith. We don't accept it. So he says we benefit from this definition that the weak narration moves up to Hasan. The da'if becomes Hasan under two conditions. Number one, it's narrated from another chain or more, whereby the chain or chains are similar or stronger. Okay? So it has to be da'if and it has another chain like it. The next condition, number two, that the reason for its weakness is due to the weak memory of the narrator or a gap in the chain, a missing narrator, or there's a narrator that's unknown. Muhammad ibn Abdullah, and we don't know who he is. Who's this guy? What did the scholars say about him? They don't know. Okay? That's one of the reasons of the weakness. But if the weakness is because he's a liar, he has a narrator that's known to be a liar, or corrupted, or a fasiq, or whatever else, no. Then this does not apply. Its position, he says to show it in a mathematical equation, or he says, it is called Hasan li ghayri, because it is not Hasan due to the first chain alone. It only became Hasan with other chains with it. And to show this in a mathematical equation, da'if plus da'if equals Hasan li ghayri. It's as simple as that. Its position is here. Number 4. The Hasan li ghayrihi is a lesser level than the Hasan li dhati. And based on this, if the Hasan li ghayri for any reason opposes the Hasan li dhati, which one do we give preference to? If that hadith opposes that one, which one do we give preference to? This one, because it's stronger. Because it's stronger. We give preference to the Hasan li dhati. Its ruling, it is from the maqbool used as dalil. We can use the Hasan li ghayrihi as proof. Now, and now he gives you an example of Hasan li ghayrihi. ما رواه الترمذي, again Imam al-Tirmidhi narrated, وحسنه, and graded that Hasan, من طريق شعبة, from the way of Shu'bah, عن عاصم, so Shu'bah, from Asim ibn Ubaidillah, from Abdullah ibn Amir ibn Rabi'a, from his father, عن أبيه, أن امرأة من بني فزارة تزوجت على نعلين فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, يعني this lady, the hadith is saying this lady got married and she accepted for her mahar a pair of sandals. Where are these women today? Wali? Unless the sandals are made of diamonds and gold. Mumkin. Allahumma musta'an. So she got married on a pair of sandals. So the Prophet ﷺ said to her, أَرَضِيتِ مِن نَفْسِكِ وَمَالِكِ بِنَعْلَيْنِ, are you pleased with a pair of sandals? قالت نعم. She said yes. فأجاز. So the Prophet ﷺ allowed it. قال الترمذي, Imam al-Tirmidhi said, وفي الباب, and in this chapter, يعني under that hadith, عن عمر. So in this hadith, in this chapter, we have another chain leading to the Sahabi Umar, wa Abi Huraira, and one from Abu Huraira, wa Sahal ibn Sa'ad, wa Abi Sa'id, wa Anas, wa Aisha, wa Jabir, wa Abi Hadradin al-Aslami. Qultu, the author of the book, he said, Asim, go back to the top. Shu'bah and Asim. That man Asim there, Asim da'if. لِسُوء حِفْظِهِ. The scholars have labeled him weak because of his bad memory. وَقَدْ حَسَّنَ لَهُ التِّرْمِذِيُّ هَذَا الْحَدِيثِ. And Imam al-Tirmidhi classed his hadith here as Hasan لِمَجِيئِهِ مِنْ غَيْرِ وَجْهِ, because it came from other chains. So that's an example of Hasan li ghayrihi. Of Hasan li ghayrihi. طيب. So this shabab is the Hasan. And these four are the accepted narrations. Now we move on to the next category. The khabar al-mardud. The rejected narrations. These are the accepted ones. Anything below that is from the narrations we do not accept, meaning the weak, and so forth. So what's the definition of rejected narrations? He says the narration in which the truthfulness of what is said has not been confirmed. So anytime we cannot confirm that these words are true or truthful, then these are the rejected narrations. We have not confirmed their truthfulness. And that is due. Why can't we confirm it? Because one or more of the conditions of authenticity has not been met. Remember this guy here? Doesn't he have 5 conditions? If one or more of those conditions are not met, even if just one is missing from the hadith, it goes all the way below, becomes from the rejected. Its types and the reasons for rejection. The types of rejected narrations and the reasons why the ulama rejected narrations. The scholars have mentioned many types of narrations which are rejected and have given these types of a number of names specific to them. And some types they have not given a specific name, rather they gave a general name for them all, which is called da'if. That's the general terminology used for the rejected narrations, da'if, weak. As for the reason for rejecting narrations, there's many. There's many reasons why a hadith will be rejected, but it all comes back to two main points. Number one, something missing in the chain. That's the first point. Or number two, a ta'an in the narrator. The narrator has been spoken about. These are the two reasons why hadith is rejected. Either something missing in the chain, or not accusation, but ta'an, injuring of the narrators. He's not trustworthy, he's a liar, or whatever else. And beneath these two main points fall a number of branches. First and foremost, the da'if. What's the meaning of da'if? He says that which does not have the attributes of a Hasan hadith due to it missing a condition from the conditions of Hasan. Here he's telling us a da'if hadith is a hadith that did not meet the condition of Hasan. Why did he say did not meet the condition of Hasan and he didn't say did not meet the condition of Sahih?
The Hasan had we can take it if one of the narrators has a little bit of weakness in memorization.
Jayyid?
Yeah, so doesn't meet one of the conditions of Hasan.
Excellent.
Yeah. So
طيب.
Now, Da'if has to not meet two conditions, like suggesting. The Hasan is missing a condition.
It's missing one of those five. So why is he saying the da'if is the hadith that does not meet the condition of Hasan? Why didn't he say does not meet the condition of Sahih? It's very simple.
Because the ruling for Hasan is a bit lenient, a bit more lenient than Sahih. If it hasn't even met that, then
Exactly. He doesn't need to go all the way there. He can start from the lowest of the maqbool. If it does not meet the conditions of the lowest maqbool, obviously it's not going to meet the conditions of the highest. So that's why he says a da'if hadith is the one that does not meet Hasan. He didn't even need to say Sahih. Because if it doesn't meet Hasan, automatically it's not going to meet Sahih. Okay? He says, weak narrations, the hadith da'ifa, are of different levels. See, like here, the accepted hadiths are different levels, right? That's the strongest, that's the lowest. Same thing with da'if. You have some da'if that is stronger than others, and then you have the weakest of them. And he shows you here, from it is da'if, some hadith is da'if. Some hadith is da'if jiddan, which means very weak. Some da'if, they call wahi. Wahi is like way off. That's probably the best translation. Like wahi, gone, it's way off. And then you have a worse level, munkar, which means corrupt. Munkar means corrupt. And then the worst of them is the mawdu', which is the fabrication. The plain outright lie. The plain outright lie is called the mawdu', the fabricated. On page 19, that which is rejected because of a gap in the chain. We said hadith can either be rejected because something in the chain missing, or because the narrators have been injured. Now we're going to go through that first type. The hadiths that are rejected because of gaps in the chain. He says the meaning of a gap in the chain is where the chain is broken by having either one or more narrators missing from it. That's called a saqt in the isnad, a gap in the chain. Either it's done either intentionally or unintentionally. It could be by mistake, and some could skip a narrator intentionally. Happens, as we will see. And it can occur either at the beginning of the chain, the middle of the chain, and the saqt could be either apparent or hidden. The gap could be noticeable, you could see it in the chain, or it could be hidden, and they're all different categories, as we are going to see. He says, the types of saqt. Number one is the zahir, the apparent. The apparent gap in the chain. This is the first type of weak hadith. When there's an apparent gap in the chain. What's an apparent gap? He says, this type is known by confirming that the narrator has not met his sheikh, who he narrates from. Okay? We're gonna write a fake chain here. We're not fabricating hadith, inshallah. It's just for the knowledge. So let's say we have a chain of Muhammad, Abdullah, Ahmad, Khalid, and then companion, and then, as we know, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. First thing we need to remember, Shabab, where's the beginning of the chain? There? No. Beginning of the chain is the person closest to you, which is him. Yeah? This is always the beginning of the chain. Beginning. End of the chain is the Sahabi. Beginning, end. So in this example, Muhammad heard from Abdullah, who heard from Ahmad, who heard from Khalid, who heard from the companion, who heard from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is just an example. He says here, the apparent gap is known by confirming that the narrator has not met his sheikh who he narrates from. Either he did not live in his time or he never met him. An example of this, Muhammad heard from Abdullah. I look into Muhammad's life, I look into Abdullah's life. I find between them there's 300 years. How can Muhammad hear from Abdullah? Possible. That's an apparent gap in the chain. Obviously there's someone missing between them. Okay? Or I look into his life, they lived in the same time, but I can confirm that he never met him. How can I confirm that? He lived all his life in Iraq, he lived all his life in Syria, never traveled. He never traveled to Syria. Apparent gap. Okay? This is what it means, an apparent gap in the chain. And the Sheikh says this is why it's important for the one who studies chains, the one who studies this field, to also study the time and history of the narrators, because it consists of when they were born, when they died, where they traveled, so you can confirm if he met him, he heard from him, and so forth. The scholars of hadith have given 4 names to the hadiths which have apparent gaps. There's 4 names. So you can call it 4 categories of weak hadith because of apparent gaps. And they are there in front of you. The first one is al-mu'allaq. The second one is al-mursal. The third one is al-mu'dal, and the fourth one is munqati'. Those four categories are all weak, and they are all weak for the same reason, because there is an apparent gap. But they're different because of where the gap is. If the gap's at the beginning, it has a name. If it's at the end, it has a name, and so forth. So if we look here, so that's the first type of gap, the apparent one. The second type of gap is the khafi. There's a gap, but it's hidden. What does hidden mean? He says this type is not known except to the Imams of Hadith, who have vast knowledge in this field, and there are two names given to hidden gaps. Number one, al-mudallas, and number two, al-mursal al-khafi. The hidden mursal. They're the two types of hidden gaps. The first four are the apparent gaps, like we explained here. If we look at the apparent gaps, the four, now we're going to take the first one. So the zahir saqt, the zahir gaps, the apparent gaps. The first one we said is al-mu'allaq. What's the mu'allaq? That which has a missing narrator or more in order. So it's one missing narrator or more. It could be 2, 3, but they have to be in order. From the beginning of the chain. Salim, beginning of the chain. Here. Excellent. So let's say Imam al-Tirmidhi is the author of the book. He heard from Muhammad, he heard from Abdullah. A mu'allaq hadith is where the gap is here. The gap is here. So it's either somewhere between the author of the book and Muhammad, or it could be between Muhammad and Abdullah. Because they're 300 years apart, there's someone missing, or 2 people missing, or 3 people missing between them. So whenever the gap is at the beginning of the chain, we call it mu'allaq, and that's a type of weak hadith, obviously. Why is this weak? Because it did not meet the conditions of authentic. Remember the condition? The chain must be connected. So when we have a gap, it has not met the condition. Okay? So the mu'allaq hadith is when the gap is at the beginning of the chain. And that's why he says the beginning of the chain is the side that is closest to us. And that is the sheikh of the author, and it is called awwalus sanad because we begin reading the hadith from it. An example of this type is when the author does not mention a chain at all. Because that is the category of a mu'allaq. Let's say, for example, Abu Dawood, rahimahullah, one of the compilers of hadith. If Abu Dawood, who's like Bukhari and Muslim, they all have their books. If Abu Dawood came, rahimahullah, and said, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. What has he done? The gap is from the beginning until the end. And it's all in sequence. He skipped the whole chain and went straight to the Prophet ﷺ. That's a mu'allaq hadith. Because it has a gap from the beginning. If it's missing one or more narrators from the beginning, and that's an example of a mu'allaq hadith. Another example is when the author does not mention the chain except for the sahabi. If Abu Dawood, rahimahullah, does not mention a chain, and he says, Abu Huraira radiallahu anhu said, the Prophet ﷺ said. So if he skipped the chain and went to the sahabi and then the Prophet ﷺ, that's mu'allaq. It's got a gap in the beginning. Okay? It's got a gap in the beginning. What is the ruling? The mu'allaq hadith is rejected because it is missing one of the conditions of authenticity, which is the connection of chain. Is that understood, Shabab?
Understood, Sheikh. Does that happen?
Happens.
Authors narrate
Yeah.
things from the Prophet ﷺ?
Yeah. Sometimes they do. It's justified depending on who does it. If it's a nobody, it's not justified. Hadith is rejected. But sometimes the ulama, even like Al-Bukhari, he would quote a hadith of Rasulullah quoting the companion and then the Prophet. But he intentionally did not mention the chain because he was probably just summarizing. He just wanted to write the...
Even though he didn't write it, the chain exists.
Exists. Exactly. Naam. And we only know that because that particular one that Bukhari would have done, we have the other chains to support it. You understand? So it comes back to who does it as well. That's an important point. So sometimes a alim might just summarize. But if the hadith is on its own, this is its grading. It's mu'allaq. Naam. The second type of da'if from apparent gaps is the mursal. And this one, shabab, has the most kalam for ahlul ilm. This is one of the more like battle between the scholars. What do we do with it? Why? Because the gap in mursal is different to all the others. Why? Because the gap is at the sahabi. It's the opposite. It's when the companion is missing. So if we looked at our fake chain here, we've got Khalid, who heard from the companion, who heard from Rasulullah. So we know, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So we know Khalid is the tabi'i. You know the tabi'in, they're the students of the Sahaba. We know here Khalid is the tabi'i because he heard it from the Sahabi who heard it from the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. If Khalid does not mention the Sahabi, if Khalid the tabi'i says, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Here, who's missing? The companion. That hadith is mursal. So the hadith mursal is when the tabi'i says the Prophet said or the Prophet done. So the gap now is at the end of the hadith, at the end of the chain, not the beginning. He says here, that which has a gap at the end of the chain after the tabi'i. And the one after the tabi'i is the sahabi. He says it is the hadith which is missing the narrator after the tabi'i. And the narrator after the tabi'i is the companion. An example of this type is where the tabi'i, regardless if he is young or old, says, قال Rasulullah, or the Messenger of Allah did such and such without mentioning the Sahabi. An example of this type in Sahih Muslim. Look here. حدثني Muhammad ibn Rafi'. Imam Muslim is saying, Muhammad ibn Rafi' informed me that he heard from Hujayn ibn al-Muthanna, who heard from Al-Layth an Aqil, who heard from Aqil, who heard from Ibn Shihab, who heard from Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib. And who's Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, shabab? Big tabi'i, massive, from the scholars of hadith. But look where the chain ended. Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم نهى عن بيع المزابنة. Oh, the companion's missing. This hadith is mursal, and it's in Sahih Muslim. As we know, according to the ulama, there are a number of hadith in Sahih Muslim which are not authentic, a handful. He says Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib is a big tabi'i. He narrated this hadith without mentioning the companion that he heard it from. And it is possible that along with the Sahabi is another narrator missing from the Tabi'een. And that's what makes the Mursal. The Mursal, we're going to see next week there's a khilaf. What do the scholars do with it? Because some accept it, some don't. The ones that accept it, they tell you, why shouldn't we accept it if all that's missing is the Sahabi? And we know all the Sahaba are trustworthy. True or not? Some scholars take the Mursal for that reason. they tell you, Sahaba doesn't matter if we know him or don't. All the Sahaba are udul. They're all trustworthy. And they say if the irsal comes from a big imam like Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, he's known that he's not going to lie or dallis in that way. So some scholars accept it. The other scholars who consider it weak and don't accept it, why do they do so? It's not because they doubt the missing Sahabi. Everyone knows the Sahaba are authentic. They say because it's possible between him and him is another tabi'i. Because he might have heard it from another tabi'i who heard it from the Sahabi. And for that reason, we cannot confirm that after Khalid it's directly the Sahabi. So for that reason, because there's someone that could possibly not be a Sahabi, we do not grade the hadith as sahih. It's mursal, weak. SubhanAllah, how amazing our scholars were. And next week, that's what we're going to cover, the different opinions regarding the mursal hadith, inshaAllah. This is where we left off with the women, but inshaAllah it's where we will leave off with yous also. Wallahu a'lam, wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi.